The bells of Paris rang deep into the October night of 1396, their solemn toll carried on the chill autumn air. Torches blazed along the narrow streets, their smoke twisting into the heavens as nobles and priests filed toward the Cathedral of St. Denis. At the very center of this spectacle, a child walked slowly beneath the weight of silks and jewels far too heavy for her small frame. Princess Isabella of Valois, only 10 years old, moved step by careful step. Her wedding gown was embroidered with gold thread that glittered in the candlelight, but her hands trembled beneath the lace. Around her, whispers stirred like restless ghosts. Some murmured blessings, others muttered doubts. The hush of the crowd was pierced only by the rustle of robes and the creak of armor from the French guards who escorted her. Before her waited the man who was to become her husband, Richard II, King of England. Nearly 40 years old, he stood in regal finery, his crown glinting in the lamplight. His face was lined with age and worry, hardened by years of political turmoil. He looked not like a groom anticipating love, but a ruler waiting for a treaty sealed in flesh and blood. For this was not a wedding of hearts. It was a bargain, a fragile thread of peace stretched between two kingdoms drenched in decades of war. France offered a child. England accepted her. And Isabella of Valois, though born to roses and gold, now found herself a pawn on the chessboard of kings. The cathedral doors closed with a heavy thud. Inside, incense filled the air, thick and suffocating. The priest's Latin chants echoed against the vaulted stone ceilings. Isabella stood beneath the towering arches, her crown slipping slightly on her head as she struggled to hold herself upright. The jeweled circlet, crafted for a grown queen, pressed into her scalp until it hurt. Her wide eyes darted to her mother, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, who nodded sternly from the pews, her own jeweled veil hiding a frown. Her father, King Charles VI of France, sat beside her, though his gaze was vacant, lost in the fog of madness that plagued him. Isabella's small fingers curled into her gown as she realized she would receive no comfort here. Richard stepped forward and took her hand. His was large and calloused, the hand of a man who had wielded power for decades. Hers was delicate, trembling, still marked by the soft innocence of childhood. The contrast was stark, almost grotesque. He spoke the vows in a voice deep and commanding. She whispered hers in a frightened whisper that barely carried across the altar. When the rings were exchanged, the congregation erupted into applause, but the sound was hollow, a victory for diplomacy, not love. Courtiers muttered among themselves, would this girl live long enough to give England an heir? Could such a fragile child truly be Queen of England? Later, as the procession carried her through candle-lit streets, Isabella sat rigid, her face pale beneath the crown. The cheers of the crowd washed over her, but she heard only fragments. Peace at last, too young, the child queen. The weight of those words pressed heavier than the jewels on her head. In her bedchamber that night, Isabella stared at the flickering flames of a single candle. Beyond the carved oak doors, her husband king conversed with his advisors, discussing treaties and politics. She curled into the vast, empty bed, her body dwarfed by the pillows and silks, her heart pounding in the silence. She was 10 years old, a child who should have been playing in the gardens of the French court, not sitting on the edge of a royal marriage bed. And though Richard II promised to treat her with kindness, to wait until she grew before asking her to fulfill her role as wife, Isabella's fate was sealed. Her childhood was gone. Her name would forever be written in history not as a girl, but as a queen, a bride child bound to a king 4 times her age. But history would not be gentle with Isabella of Valois. Within a few short years, her husband would be dead, leaving her a widow before she was even 12. Cast adrift between kingdoms, she would be forced into another marriage she did not choose, and her brief life would end in tragedy. This is not the story of a fairy tale princess. It is the story of a child sacrificed to politics, a queen who never knew freedom, and a life cut short by the crown she was too small to bear. Before the heavy crown was set upon her head, Isabella of Valois lived her earliest years in the glittering but troubled halls of the French court. Born in 1389, she was the daughter of King Charles VI of France, a man both admired and feared, remembered by history as Charles the Mad. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, was famed for her beauty, her lavish taste, and her unyielding grip on power. The court of France was a palace of contradictions. On one hand, it dazzled with jeweled tapestries, music, and the fragrance of roses carried in from royal gardens. On the other, it trembled under the weight of war and whispers of madness. Isabella grew up in chambers filled with velvet and gold, yet even in the laughter of courtiers there lingered unease. Her father, Charles VI, was a man of sudden transformations. At times he was gentle, playing with Isabella and her siblings, laughing as he called them his precious jewels. But then, without warning, shadows would cross his mind. He would lash out, striking those nearest to him, or wander the corridors claiming not to know his own name, his hair wild, his eyes empty. On some days he swore he was made of glass and begged his servants not to touch him lest he shatter. For young Isabella, her father was both king and stranger, protector and danger. Her mother, Queen Isabel, managed the court with a steady hand, though many despised her for her extravagance. She wore gowns threaded with pearls and rode in carriages lined with silk, even as the people of Paris cried out under the burden of war taxes. Yet it was Isabel who shielded Isabella from the storm of politics as long as she could, surrounding her with governesses, tutors, and ladies-in-waiting who sought to preserve her innocence. Isabella's days in the palace began in sunshine. She played with dolls carved from ivory and dressed in miniature gowns made by seamstresses. She embroidered flowers onto scraps of linen under the watchful eye of her tutors, her small fingers pricked by the needle as she learned patience stitch by stitch. She giggled with her sisters as they raced through the palace gardens, chasing each other through fountains and rose bushes. For a time, she was simply a child, shielded from the storms gathering outside the wall. But innocence in royal courts never lasted long. The 100 Years' War with England had already stretched across generations, and peace was a fragile illusion. French nobles and English envoys stalked the palace halls, debating alliances and treaties in hushed voices. Isabella heard her name more and more often, spoken not as little Isabella, but as a bargaining chip, a solution to endless bloodshed. By the time she was 6, her future was being decided in council chambers thick with smoke and argument. "The girl is of royal blood," they whispered. "She is young enough to mold, old enough to wed, and her hand can bring England to the table." The men who plotted her marriage never once looked at her as a child. To them, she was a peace offering, a living pledge of loyalty between nations. Her mother began preparing her quietly, replacing dolls with lessons in etiquette, embroidery with rehearsals of curtsies and ceremonial words. Isabella still longed for play, but at each birthday she was reminded that her duty was greater than her desires. She was told that her smile could end a war, her obedience could save thousands, her body itself a bridge between kingdoms. In the flickering candlelight of the French court, Isabella Valois' childhood faded away not with a single blow, but in small sacrifices. A toy put aside, a game left unfinished, a bedtime story replaced with lessons on diplomacy. By the age of 10, when most children still dreamed of play, Isabella's fate was sealed. She would not belong to herself nor to France. She would belong to England, a child queen in a foreign land, her life bound not to her own will, but to the ambitions of kings. By the late 1390s, France and England had been locked in the 100 Years' War for more than 6 decades. Blood had soaked the fields of both kingdoms, castles had changed hands in waves of sieges, and peace seemed like nothing more than a fragile dream. But in 1396, that dream took the shape of a child. The Treaty of Paris was meant to halt the endless cycle of raids and battles. For King Richard II of England, the truce required more than parchment and signatures. He demanded flesh and blood. "She must be of royal blood," his envoys declared. "And she must be young enough to ensure loyalty, a daughter of France bound to England by marriage." The French council deliberated for months, weighing daughters and nieces, searching for a princess to appease England's weary king. Their choice fell on Isabella of Valois. She was only 6 years old when negotiations began. Too young to understand the language of treaties, too innocent to imagine the life awaiting her, Isabella was selected not as a bride, but as a solution. Her marriage would be the cornerstone of peace, or so the men in silk robes and jeweled chains believed. For 4 years, envoys crossed the Channel, haggling over dowries and promises. Isabella's name passed from parchment to lips, her value calculated in gold, land, and political advantage. When the final terms were agreed, her mother, Queen Isabella, wept not out of joy but resignation. She had married for politics herself, and now her daughter would pay the same price before reaching womanhood. The preparations for Isabella's wedding began in the summer of 1396. Seamstresses labored for weeks to create gowns glittering with pearls and gold thread. Jewels were gathered from across France, a crown too large for her head, necklaces that dragged against her chest, rings that slid from her tiny fingers. To the court she was radiant. To Isabella, each gem was a chain, binding her to a destiny she had not chosen. When the day arrived, nobles whispered uneasily as they watched her enter the cathedral. The crown slipped to one side, nearly toppling from her head until a lady-in-waiting adjusted it quickly. Her small body trembled under the weight of fabrics meant for a grown woman. She was a child dressed in the costume of a queen. Some onlookers averted their eyes, muttering that the marriage was indecent. Others praised it as the sacrifice needed for peace. That night in her new chambers, Isabella sat quietly while her ladies undressed her, removing layers of silk and jewels. The vast marriage bed seemed to swallow her whole. Her eyes welled with tears, and she whispered that she wanted her mother. The women around her soothed her with soft voices, brushing her hair and singing prayers to calm her. Richard II entered not long after. His presence filled the room, a man of nearly 40, seasoned by war and court intrigue, standing over a bride who still clutched at her dolls in secret. He reassured her with words she could barely understand, promising that their marriage would not be consummated until she was older. To those who later told the story, Richard treated Isabella more as a daughter than a wife. But in the dark corridors of power, promises were fragile. Alliances shifted with each new rebellion, every fresh betrayal. The English lords who despised Richard's French queen whispered already, "What use is a child bride?" And though the treaty gave Europe a brief pause from war, it also sealed Isabella's fate. She was no longer a daughter of France. She was Queen of England, a pawn dressed in gold, a child whose tears were ignored in favor of treaties and crowns. This was the promise of peace, a child handed to a king. But promises in politics rarely last. When Isabella's ship crossed the English Channel in the autumn of 1396, the waves crashed violently against its sides, as if the sea itself resisted her passage. Wrapped in furs, the little bride stared out at the gray horizon. France, with its gardens and familiar voices, was already fading behind her. Ahead lay England, foreign, cold, and uncertain. Crowds gathered as her entourage landed at Dover. Trumpets announced her arrival, banners of England and France fluttered in the wind, and the people craned their necks to glimpse the child who now bore the title Queen of England. To them she was a curiosity, a political prize. Few saw the frightened 10-year-old beneath the layers of velvet and pearls. The English court received her with ceremony. She was ushered through towering halls of Westminster, where stern-faced lords and ladies bowed deeply as she passed. Isabella's small steps echoed against the stone floors. Every action was scripted, the way she lowered her head, the words she spoke, even the way she smiled. To the English nobles, she was not a child but a symbol, paraded in jewels to prove peace with France. But once the ceremonies ended, reality settled in. Isabella was surrounded by strangers who spoke a language she barely understood. She sat at long banquets where the laughter and conversation swirled around her like a storm, while she clutched her goblet in silence. Letters sent to her mother in Paris were her only comfort, written by scribes in careful French, her childish words filled with longing. "I wish to come home. The nights are so long here." Richard II, however, treated her with kindness. Though nearly 4 times her age, he showed her patience. He gifted her books filled with French prayers, jewels she could admire though they were too large for her small hands, and dolls carved of ivory that reminded her of home. He called her Ma Belle Petite Reine, my beautiful little queen, and often spoke to her gently, more as a father would to a daughter. When he dined, he invited her to sit beside him, lifting her cup for her when it grew too heavy. And yet the kindness of her husband-king did not shield her from the whispers. At court, the nobles muttered behind closed doors, "What use is a child queen? She brings no heir, she brings only French influence." Some scoffed openly, calling her the little French doll, a puppet in silk. Richard's decision to wed Isabella had angered many of his lords. They saw the marriage as proof of his weakness, too eager to bow before France, too desperate for peace. His unpopularity grew, and with it rebellion brewed. Armed men gathered in secret, nobles whispered treason, and the shadow of unrest crept into every corner of the realm. Isabella was too young to understand the depth of this danger, but she felt it. She saw the way courtiers' eyes darkened when she entered the hall, the way servants stiffened when her name was spoken. She sensed the resentment that clung to her like smoke. She adored Richard, who had shown her tenderness in a world of cruelty, but she also feared the nobles who despised her presence. For in their eyes, Isabella was not a queen, she was a symbol of everything wrong with Richard's rule. His extravagance, his French alliances, his failure to command loyalty. To them, she was the face of a treaty they hated, a child who embodied the king's folly. And so, even as Richard shielded her from harm, the tide of history turned against them both. Within only a few short years, rebellion would rise. Richard's throne would crumble, and Isabella, still barely a child, would discover that crowns offered no protection when kingdoms demanded blood. The year was 1399, and England trembled. Richard II, once crowned with pomp and praised for his refinement, had grown increasingly unpopular. His lavish spending, his reliance on favorites, and his iron-fisted treatment of rebellious nobles had drained the patience of his lords. Among his enemies stood his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, a man ambitious enough to seize what he believed was his birthright. While Richard campaigned in Ireland, Henry returned from exile with an army. What began as a demand to reclaim his inheritance swelled into full rebellion. Nobles deserted Richard in droves, their banners falling to Bolingbroke's side. The anointed king, once majestic in his power, found himself abandoned, betrayed, and at last captured. For Isabella, barely 11, the collapse came like a storm tearing through her fragile world. One moment she was Queen of England, seated beside Richard at banquets, smiling shyly beneath the heavy crown. The next, she was a child in a castle full of whispers, hearing only that her husband was taken prisoner. Richard was confined first in the Tower of London, then in Pontefract Castle. Rumors spread quickly that he was starved, that he was beaten, that he was left to wither in darkness. Isabella, too young to grasp the intricacies of politics, clung only to her prayers. Night after night she knelt before the chapel altar, whispering pleas in French. "Protect him, God, let him come back to me." Servants wept to hear her childish voice echoing through the cold stone corridors. A queen in title, but still a girl begging for her husband's return. But Richard never returned. By early 1400, the news came, whispered first in courtiers' halls, then confirmed in proclamations. Richard II was dead. Whether by starvation, murder, or despair, the king had perished in captivity. Isabella, not yet 12, was a widow. She refused to believe it at first. When told of Richard's death, she wept so violently that her attendants feared for her health. She demanded to see him, to be brought to his side. But no body was given to her, no farewell allowed. She clutched at his books and gifts, pressing her face to them as though they might still carry his warmth. She was a child robbed not only of her husband, but of any chance to say goodbye. Henry Bolingbroke, now crowned Henry IV, saw Isabella not as a grieving widow, but as a tool. He demanded that she remain in England, for her blood was too valuable to release. To cement his new dynasty, he proposed that she marry his son, the young Henry of Monmouth, who would one day become Henry V to Henry IV. It was perfect. the French princess once tied to Richard, now bound to his own line. But Isabella shocked the court. With a courage far beyond her years, she refused. In her soft French accent, she declared that she would never marry the son of my husband's enemy. Those who heard it never forgot the defiance in her voice, a child daring to resist the will of the English king. Henry was enraged. For her resistance, Isabella was placed under strict confinement. She was guarded, her movements restricted, her correspondence monitored. Alone in her chambers, she wept for Richard, but she did not bend. Each time the question arose, she repeated her refusal. Better to return to France in shame than to share a bed with the blood of the man who had stolen her crown and her husband's life. At last, her persistence prevailed. By 1401, Henry IV, weary of her defiance and facing troubles of his own, agreed to send her back to France. The journey home was somber. No longer the glittering bride of peace, Isabella returned as a widow, her childhood gone, her innocence shattered. The French court received her with sympathy, praising her loyalty to Richard's memory. Chroniclers noted that she dressed in mourning black and refused to remove it, even at her young age. To some, she became a symbol of honor, a girl queen who had stood against an enemy king, but her story was far from over. France still saw her as valuable, and in time her family would find another match for her. For Isabella of Valois, widowhood at 11 was not the end of her suffering. It was only the beginning. When Isabella returned to France in 1401, she was no longer the laughing child who had once raced through palace gardens. She was 12 years old, dressed in black mourning robes, a widow before she had learned what marriage meant. At the French court, she was received with sympathy and admiration. Chroniclers praised her steadfast loyalty to Richard's memory, noting how she kept her mourning veil and spoke of him with reverence, even when others pressed her to forget. To her mother and to the people of Paris, Isabella became a symbol of dignity. A girl queen who had endured humiliation and captivity with courage. But beneath the words of comfort, politics whispered louder. Her family did not see a grieving child, they saw an asset. France was still tangled in the 100 Years' War, and every royal daughter was a bargaining chip. Isabella's mourning was permitted for a time, but as she grew older, her tears no longer interested the council. By her mid-teens, the same voices that had bartered her to England returned with new plans. At 16, Isabella was told she would marry again. Her new husband would be her cousin, Charles, Duke of Orleans, a young man closer to her in age than Richard II had been, but still chosen not for love, only for alliance. Charles was a poet, gentle and thoughtful, but their union was arranged as a calculation, a tightening of bloodlines within the Valois dynasty. For Isabella, the second marriage was less grotesque than the first, but no less devoid of choice. The wedding took place quietly, without the thunder of church bells or the pomp of foreign treaties. France celebrated it as prudent, a way to strengthen the Orleans line, but to Isabella it was the confirmation that she would never escape her role as a pawn. She entered the marriage with little enthusiasm, her heart still tethered to the memory of Richard, the husband she had lost as a child. At court her melancholy deepened. Those who observed her noted that she seemed older than her years, her face pale, her eyes shadowed. She smiled rarely. She walked through the halls with measured steps, her veil trailing behind her, her words soft and restrained. The gaiety of her youth had long vanished. She was dutiful, obedient, but quiet, as though the weight of two marriages, one to a man far too old and the other to a cousin chosen by politics, had drained her spirit. Charles of Orleans was kind to her, but kindness could not erase grief. Their marriage was marked by distance rather than intimacy, partnership rather than passion. He devoted himself to writing verses and navigating noble rivalries, while Isabella withdrew further into herself. The French court, restless and vibrant, became to her a place of isolation. Surrounded by people, she felt alone. Her ladies whispered that she still spoke often of Richard II, keeping relics of her brief years in England close by, a book he had gifted her, a carved figure from his court. They said she sometimes wept at night, praying not for her future, but for the husband taken from her in childhood. Though she bore the title of Duchess of Orleans, Isabella remained a woman trapped by dynastic ambition. She had been a child queen, a widow at 11, and now, at 16, she was once again a wife without choice. Her life unfolded like a script written by others, each act defined by political necessity rather than personal will. And soon, tragedy would find her again. By the age of 19, Isabella of Valois had already lived through more sorrow than most women twice her age. She had been a child bride, a queen in name, a widow at 11, and then remarried as a pawn of dynastic necessity. Her second marriage to Charles, Duke of Orleans, was gentler than her first, but it offered little joy. At court she remained quiet and distant, a figure draped in dignity but hollowed by grief. In 1409 she gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and difficult, her frail body weakened by years of melancholy and strain. Those present described her exhaustion as overwhelming, her breath shallow, her skin pale as marble. When the infant's first cry pierced the chamber, the midwives rejoiced, but Isabella herself was slipping away. Within hours of bringing life into the world, she closed her eyes for the final time. She was only 19. Her daughter, named Joan, would go on to play her own role in the tangled web of French and English politics. Through her, the blood of Isabella of Valois continued to flow into future generations, binding the Valois and Orleans lines together. But Isabella herself did not live to see her child grow, nor to feel the comfort of motherhood after a life so dominated by duty. For the court, her death was a quiet tragedy, another princess sacrificed to the brutal necessities of alliance and succession. For history, she became a footnote, overshadowed by the louder figures of her age, her father, Charles VI the Mad, her husband, Richard II of England, her cousin, Charles of Orleans, who would later be immortalized as a poet. Isabella's story, the story of a girl forced into womanhood before her time, faded into obscurity. And yet her life speaks volumes about the age in which she lived. She was a child stolen from her games and dolls to become a bride of state. She was a queen crowned not for her own merit, but to buy a fragile truce between warring kingdoms. She was a widow before she could understand marriage, a bargaining chip shuffled between thrones, a daughter, a wife, and finally a mother who never held her child long enough to know her. Her story is not one of triumph, but of survival cut short. It is a reminder that beneath the grand treaties and glittering coronations were human beings, girls with tender hearts forced into roles far too heavy for their shoulders. Isabella of Valois lived and died not for herself, but for the ambitions of others. In the end, she left little behind but silence. No great speeches, no victories, no reign. Only a fragile legacy carried in the veins of her daughter and the memory of a crown that never fit. She entered history as a bride child, draped in silk too heavy for her shoulders. She left it as a young woman, broken by duty, remembered only as the queen who was never truly a wife.